Welcome. Thank you very much for joining us. Shelley Welton, who you'll hear from in just a few minutes, and I have been excited about this. We've been thinking about this for, 6 months, maybe longer than that, and thrilled to see the conversation coming together. We're really excited about the panelists. I was told a couple of panelists, I haven't told all of you. This is really selfish on my part. This is a topic that I want to learn a lot more about, so we thought we would organize a conference where we get people together who know much more about it than I do and learn through the process. So our goals for the day are to bring together what I think of as different threads of energy and economic challenges that are taking place out there. And often I don't see these conversations coming together in the way that I think that they need to. On one side of the energy and economic development question, we have, with a changing energy system, we're seeing jobs lost in rural areas, whether it be shutting down power plants, shutting down mines, and those are social problems, those are local community development problems, those are also environmental problems, public health problems, and they have direct impact on the politics of energy. On the other side of that equation, we're seeing a lot of investment taking place in rural areas, whether it be pipelines, transmission, new power plants, solar farms, wind farms. And I think we haven't quite figured out how to make sure that those investments that are taking place in the rural areas are done in a way that really benefits the communities where the investments are taking place. So we want to think a little bit deeper about that. So Shelley's going to provide more of an overview of some of the challenges and provide more of an overview of the day. Before we pass the microphone over to Shelley, I do want to say a couple of housekeeping things. If you are here and you need CLE credit, we have the forms out on the table, and the students sitting at the table can point to those forms and make sure you get that taken care of. If you parked at the Rams Head parking deck, let me know the other day. We have vouchers, so we can cover the cost of parking over there. With that, I think we'll really get started in the substance. So I'll pass it over to Shelley Welton, who is an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina School of Law, and we're lucky enough that she's joined us here at UNC School of Law for this semester teaching energy and environmental law and helping us out at the Center for Climate, Energy, Environment, and Economics. So, welcome, Shelley.
Thank you guys all so much for being here today. So I'm visiting this fall and commuting back and forth from South Carolina. And Jonas talked me into doing this, and one of the ways he talked me into doing this was by promising that we could hold this conference on exactly this topic. So I'm so happy that this day is finally here. I think that CE3, the Center for Energy, Economics, and Environment, is a great organization to be getting involved in this topic, and I have really high hopes that coming out of today, there'll be some really interesting new directions for the group to pursue. And then I want to thank you all for coming to be a part of this conversation. I'm really excited about seeing what unfolds over the course of the day. So our motivation for organizing this conference is this growing awareness that there's this transition going on in the United States away from fossil fuels and towards cleaner sources of energy. And that it's likely to disproportionately impact rural communities along several dimensions. And the really beautiful thing about being in this introductory position is that I'm going to offer some framing remarks and throw out a bunch of questions and not try to answer them at all. So I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes or so framing some of the key ways that I think the transition is likely to impact rural communities and some of the key legal and policy questions that I see arising out of this transitioning energy sector and that we might discuss over the course of the day. Then I'm going to offer just a brief introduction to how we structure the rest of the day, and we'll get off and rolling. All right, so the last several years have documented this sort of increasing cultural and economic divide in the rural and the urban in the United States. We're seeing a lot of headlines like this. Rural and urban Americans equally convinced, the rest of the country dislikes them. And of course, if you think back to the history of energy, this has long been sort of a central divide in energy law, right? Whereas we had utilities that were willing to come in and electrify urban areas, it took the Rural Electrification Act and local communities working together to form cooperatives to get the rural areas of the country electrified. And now we see climate change posing new threats for rural America. And I think several recent studies really bring this point home. So the goal that was reached in the International Copenhagen Accord was to try to keep planetary warming to 2 degrees Celsius. That was reiterated in the 2015 Paris Agreement, and that agreement also said that we'd like to try at least for 1.5 degrees. And one of the things they did there was they commissioned a study to understand what's the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees. That study came out last month from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And it has some pretty stunning findings about the dramatic effects of that extra 0.5 degrees between 1.5 and 2 degrees of planetary warming, including twice as large a decline in marine fisheries, twice as large a decline in corn harvests, and 10 million additional people at risk from sea level rise, just from that extra 0.5 degrees of warming. Okay, so I think if you combine that with this 2017 study from Science Magazine, they demonstrated that within the U.S., the Southeast is by far the most heavily impacted of any region by climate change. All right, so this is loss in GDP at the end of the century, and you can see that the South is much more heavily hit. This is 2080 to 2099, but you certainly don't need to look that far into the future to start to understand how the impacts of climate change are worsening in the U.S. I think Hurricanes Michael and Florence kind of brought the point home for us this fall in many ways. One other thing that study found is that poor counties suffer more than wealthier counties, meaning that, as the authors conclude, this is a quote, climate change tends to increase pre-existing inequality in the United States. Right? And then, of course, these impacts of climate change are layered on top of what is already a long history of rural communities and poor communities and communities of color in particular, bearing a lot of the brunt of our hazardous waste, of our pollution. They've really become these sacrifice zones in America. So the environmental justice movement is a decades-long movement that's already documented a lot of the ways in which a lot of rural communities, and particularly poor communities and communities of color, have already been disproportionately impacted by fossil fuel energy. Okay, so these impacts of climate change on rural communities are not the focus of today's conference, but I do think that they provide some important framing for the conversations that we're going to have today. Okay, so what is today's conference about? Just in brief, it's about the way in which the rapid transition that we're starting to see towards cleaner energy, which is already underway and is likely to accelerate, is going to impact rural communities in particular. And I thought I would turn now to some good news. So we're probably already aware of this news, but it never hurts to be reminded of it, which is that clean energy is continuing to grow at a rapid clip in the United States. So these are kind of small, but I just really want to give some broad sort of trend lines here. Right, on your left, you have wind growth from 2000 to 2017. On your right, you have the blue lines are solar growth from 2009 to 2016. That's price of solar, and that little orange line going down, right? So prices of renewables going way down, installations going way up. And some of that's due to state policies, some of it's due to changing economics of new technologies, some of it's due to economies of scale as we start to scale up in our ability to build these things. In any event, renewable energy, even with all federal policies on the table right now, is not going away. And that's great news, right? Because if we're going to reach anything close to this 1.5 degree number that the IPCC predicts that is the number we should try to hit, it's going to require approximately a 12-fold increase in renewables in the US between now and 2050. That's based on some rough calculations from a couple of reports that have looked at deep decarbonization in the US and what kinds of infrastructure change we would need. So I made a super rough graphic display of what I'm talking about here. This is probably not perfectly to scale, but it's just to try to kind of get my point across. Okay, so this is that wind chart shrunk down to the growth that happened in wind between 2000 and 2017. If we're going to reach deep decarbonization, we're talking about around a 12-fold increase in infrastructure in just double that amount of time, right? So that trend line is going to have to get even steeper. Now, I'm not suggesting we're necessarily going to reach those targets, but the fact remains, I think, that renewables are likely to grow rapidly, and the more we try to reach those targets, they're going to grow at an increasing clip, right? And this is a very good thing for the country and for the world. Helps address climate change, helps create domestic jobs, improves local air quality as fossil fuels are displaced by renewables. So the movement to clean energy is a gain on the whole, and I think it's good to start by remembering that. But it also comes with two key sets of challenges, which I think you could view as flip sides of the same coin. Right, so some communities are going to be left behind to contend with degraded landscapes and economic prospects, and some communities are going to be asked to take on new infrastructure opportunities and burdens and to host new industries. And questions arise here about how to minimize the burdens and maximize the benefits for those communities absorbing these new projects. So I want to take a few minutes and just ask a few broad questions about each of these challenges. So first, let's talk about communities left behind. So most obviously, this is communities that have somehow hosted coal infrastructure. Perhaps ultimately, though, it could also include communities that have experienced hydraulic fracturing. So the legal scholars Rob Burchick and Sidney Shapiro argued in a paper earlier this year that regulatory advocates often seem really glib about the real costs that are imposed on certain communities who lose their livelihoods, who lose their way of life during this transition, right? A lot of environmentalists will say, look, the transition is good because it creates far more jobs than are lost, and cleaner energy is better for everyone. And I think that statement is absolutely right, but it also falls prey to the same critique that environmental justice advocates have been leveling at cost-benefit analysis for decades, right? Which is that understanding overall costs and overall benefits tells you nothing about the distribution of those costs and those benefits, right? So in a dream world, you might have solar jobs come in to replace those coal jobs on a one-for-one basis, and you're building solar panels right on top of that mountaintop that's been mined. It usually doesn't line up so neatly. And even where you do get those new kinds of jobs, they're often not of the same character as the jobs lost, right? Probably non-union, lower paying. So, at the same time, you've got these same communities that are dealing with long-term ecological burdens of extractive industry. Right? So devastated landscapes, impeded water quality, all the resultant health impacts that go along with that. And they've suffered those impacts for the sake of fueling the entire country over the last century plus. So if you do worry about these disproportionate negative impacts on certain places, several complicated questions arise. I'm just going to throw out there a few of them. One, are these communities owed some sort of special duty above and beyond other communities that have lost their industrial base? And from where does this duty spring? And then, what tools are effective in helping communities that have lost fossil fuel-based infrastructure to transition to something more sustainable? What works, what doesn't? Do we have any models, either from within the energy sector or without, to draw from, any success stories to look to? Okay, so that's communities left behind. Let's talk now for just a minute about the flip side of the coin, which is communities hosting new infrastructure. Wind and solar, so the quintessential renewable resources, themselves are likely to put certain strains on rural communities because these are really land-intensive resources. And so they're going to alleviate some of the toxic burden, some of the air pollution burden, but they also require more physical land mass. And they often require construction of transmission lines to go along with them, to move the electricity from these rural areas to demand centers. So they're not cost-free, even if they are really good news. And then other renewables produce even more controversy, including biofuels, which we're going to hear a little bit about today. And here in North Carolina, one of the big topics recently has been biogas from hog farms. Right? So you can cap a hog farm and capture the methane, and that does a lot of good for greenhouse gas emissions. But these farms pose other risks to residents living nearby that methane capture alone cannot alleviate. So what do you do about those challenges? And then there are big questions about how large a role natural gas should play in this clean energy transition. We're seeing a substantial push for pipelines in the Southeast right now. There's 12 applications currently pending at the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission for pipelines coming into the Southeast. And of course, natural gas has its own set of pros and cons. cleaner than coal, both in terms of climate and in terms of local air impacts. It backs up the variability of renewable energy, which can be really good to have more renewables coming onto the grid. But fracking and other natural gas infrastructure have their own impacts on communities. And emerging research suggests that methane emissions from fracking may actually negate some of the combustion gains that natural gas has over coal. So, all of these are potential burdens facing these new communities receiving new infrastructure. But at the same time that we think about these burdens, it's also important to keep in mind the many benefits that can come with this infrastructure, right? So, lease payments, tax revenues, new jobs. So I think one of the first key questions in starting to unpack these infrastructure burdens and benefits is, what benefits does new infrastructure bring? What burdens does it bring? And how does this differ from one set of infrastructure to the next? Another key question is, what tools exist for communities to try to manage this transition as it happens? How much say do communities have regarding the terms on which they welcome this new infrastructure? And then finally, who bears the brunt of these impacts and who reaps the benefits? Which is to say, are low-income communities and communities of color going to be asked to shoulder the burdens of this infrastructure just like they have shouldered many of the burdens of the past fossil fuel infrastructure? And how well do our environmental justice regimes do in sort of tracking and monitoring how this new layer of infrastructure tracks onto levels of pre-existing inequality? Okay, so the final thing I want to spend a couple minutes talking about is how these challenges are interrelated. So in many ways, I think they do implicate different legal and policy regimes. And the conclusion may be in some cases that they're just best addressed separately. But they're also both intimately connected to energy governance, to energy regulation. And so part of our goal for today is to understand how energy law can and should approach this shifting relationship that the field is experiencing with rural America. And also to understand more how energy law interrelates with some of the other legal tools that we have available to manage these challenges, including land use law, labor law, community development law, and policy. So I want to wrap up with what I see as just a few of the common threads that unite these concerns. And I'm sure we're going to see some other of these emerge throughout our conversation today. Okay, so a few common threads. The first is questions of procedural and participatory justice, which is to say, who decides and how. Right? A lot of the decisions about closing down old infrastructure, about permitting new infrastructure, happen at public utility commissions and the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. These are not easy sites for participation. They're densely adjudicative, densely technical, really hard places for local communities to come and participate. And for some communities facing new infrastructure, state law delegates some authority to localities to have a say in how the infrastructure gets sited. And the question then becomes how to be inclusive in those siting processes in terms of who has a voice and power to shape the outcome at the community level. And then for communities that are facing a loss of industry, a voice in what the future shape of the community looks like can be a really important part of a successful revitalization strategy. All right, so a related question is who decides what? And by that, I mean questions about governments and the proper level of government to make these decisions, right? So what's the right role for the federal government here? What's the right role for states? What's the right role for local governments? And do our current jurisdictional frameworks sort of properly structure this balance of authority as we move into a pretty different set of energy challenges for the next century? Okay, two more questions. The third is questions of distributive justice. I mean, in some ways, what really unites the two concerns that we're talking about today is just the simple matter of geography. But the geography of rurality is linked to a lot of cultural and economic factors, including one point that I find quite salient as a place to start this conversation. So this report on rural energy burdens, where energy burdens is a measure of the percentage of household income that's spent on energy, came out earlier this year and found, and here I'm quoting, rural households have a median energy burden of 4.4% compared to the national burden of 3.3%. Rural low-income households are even worse off, shouldering a median energy burden almost 3 times greater than the burden faced by their higher income counterparts. Other rural residents hit particularly hard include the elderly, non-white, and renting households, and those living in multifamily or manufactured homes. The problem is most glaring in the East and Southeast. And so, the transition we're talking about today is asking rural families to take on additional infrastructure burdens, on top of the burdens that they've long faced in getting affordable energy, and on top of the environmental harms that they've already experienced, and on top of their enhanced risk for climate change. And for this reason, I think the question of how we fund the clean energy transition and whether there's some broader way of helping to assist rural communities that are facing particular challenges during this transition will be a critically important part of how we assist rural communities, whether the community's losing or receiving infrastructure. And I'll just throw out here, some of that assistance might also include more opportunities for communities to have some sort of economic gain from this infrastructure, be it owning their own projects, having a hand in projects. Okay, the last thing I want to talk about quickly is how this relates to the politics of decarbonization. Both sort of at the micro level and the macro level. So at the macro level, so to come back to these IPCC numbers that I've been talking about, if we're even going to come close to accelerating into the kind of transition that's going to be necessary to meet the goals that the scientists tell us we need to meet, it's going to require a massive buy-in of the American people. And even if the number of coal jobs out there isn't enormous, right? This is a point a lot of environmentalists like to make. It's not actually that many jobs. The rhetoric around these jobs has really captured the imagination of the American electorate, unlike a lot of other job categories. And so perhaps there are pragmatic, as well as I would say deeper ethical reasons to care about these communities. Similarly, one of the worst ways to accelerate this transition is for companies that are hoping to build new clean energy infrastructure or some of its supporting technologies to make an enemy of the places in which they want to put that infrastructure. Drives up costs, creates a lot of uncertainty, makes financing harder. And so I think coming up with good strategies for community involvement and buy-in also has some pragmatic payoffs. So in short, if the clean energy transition is done on the backs of rural America, largely for the benefit of dense urban centers, I think it may be challenging to make the progress that we desperately need. And so even as we strive for this sort of rapid clean energy progress, I think we need to be thoughtful about questions of benefits and burdens and equity. Okay, so thanks for giving me the opportunity to tee this off. I'm really excited to turn it over to a wonderful lineup of experts across these topics. I thought I'd walk just very quickly through the agenda for the day. Hopefully you have a paper copy, but I just was going to map quickly how these relate to some of our big themes. So we're going to start with a panel on shifting energy landscapes that looks more in depth at some of these changes that are coming to the energy sector. The second panel on harnessing the benefits of new energy investments is really about this side of the coin that is the communities that are receiving new infrastructure, how to manage that sort of shift in community character. I'm going to give you some food, a little break. And then panel 3 is really about these communities that are left behind, right? So how do you mitigate some of these impacts on communities that are losing what has been their livelihood? And then panel 4, at the end of the day, close things out, is really asking this governance question, right? Who are the private and public actors that are involved in this transition? Do we have sort of the right regimes in place to manage it? Okay, without further ado, let's get started.
The first